So I think I'll get things started here, and other folks may join us, but just seeing that it's a little after 6 and recognizing that it's a very beautiful evening out there. I don't want to keep people for any longer than they need to. So thank you all for attending this evening. Just for introductions, my name is Matt Bockler. I'm a senior planner at the Windham Regional Commission. I mainly focus on municipal planning assistance for WRC, but I'm also leading up the regional plan update process. And I'm also joined by Sue Westa, our associate director, and Chris Campany, our executive director this evening. And we'll all be taking portions of this presentation, but I'm just going to kick it off here. Just to give you a sense of what we're going to cover this evening. So before we talk about the regional plan itself, we just wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about the Regional Planning Commission, just so you understand who we are at Windham Regional Commission. We'll cover the role of the regional plan. I'll go over some data looking at current population, housing, and economic trends. And then we'll talk about broad goals that WRC has for this regional plan update, how folks can get involved, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end as well. So to start us off, I'm going to hand it over to Chris just to give an introduction to the Windham Regional Commission for those that might be less familiar with our organization. So.
Great, thank you, Matt. And Matt, thank you for the fantastic job you've been doing leading our work on the regional plan update. Matt is one of our senior planners, but this is his first foray, and I think in updating a regional plan, I think he's doing a great job. And he'll get into the details, but we're leading the charge among the Vermont regional planning commissions and doing a fully digital plan. So not only is Matt taking on, along with the other staff, the regional plan update, but also doing it in a way that we hope will be more usable by a broader array of people, and really present information in a very effective way, and hope that people will be able to find information more quickly than if it was a traditional paper document converted into a PDF. So Windham Regional Commission was founded in 1965. We serve 27 towns in Windham, Bennington, and Windsor counties over about a 920 square mile in southeast Vermont. The towns, so it's the 23 towns of Windham County, Reedsboro, Searsburg, and Windhall and Bennington County, and Weston and Windsor County. Our mission is to assist towns to provide effective local governance and work collaboratively with them to address regional issues. And in the absence of county government, we provide an essential link between local, state, and federal government. Go to the next slide, Matt. And so these are the towns. And one of the things that's really important about a regional plan that makes it a bit different than, say, a town plan is that the regional plan is adopted by the town-appointed commissioners from the towns that we serve, from our member towns, from these 27 towns. Somerset's a little different in that it's an unincorporated town, and they have a state-appointed supervisor, but otherwise each town can appoint up to 2 commissioners, and those are the people who ultimately vote on whether or not to approve the regional plan. And towns, once the region has adopted it, towns then have, I think it's 30 days or 35 days, to veto it effective, ostensibly. And if more than 50% of the member towns veto it, then we have to go back to the drawing board. That hasn't happened, but that's the process. So it's really, we seek a lot of public input, a lot of stakeholder input. Input from everybody from state agencies, nonprofit organizations, and certainly individuals, but it's ultimately our commissioners that vote to update the plan. And one of the things I'll wrap up with is, one of the things we really want to emphasize in this plan is what is it that the Windham Regional Commission can actually do to implement the policies. And one of the things that's at the foundation of this plan is a strong policy framework. And that guides all of the work that we do. But another piece that we're going to do is really highlight, as we identify issues and opportunities and concerns, what town roles are. So let's just say like rural sprawl is a concern, large single family home development, parcelization of land. There's only so much the regional commission can do, but there's a lot that towns can do. And so one of the things that we really want to do as part of this document is have it serve as kind of a handbook to regional and municipal planning. So as this plan gets developed, we'll be calling out these things that are like within our purview and things that are within the purview of the municipalities. Matt, did you want me to cover anything else, or?
I think that's good for now. Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you, Chris. And just to get into a little more detail about the regional plan itself. So the regional plan is required to cover the same topics that a town plan is required to cover under state statute. And those are listed out here. Land use, transportation, energy, utilities and facilities, natural resources, scenic and historic resources, housing, economic development, and flood resilience. But we at Windham Regional Commission, we're addressing these issues at the regional level as compared to a municipality that's just focusing on these issues generally within their borders. And so we're looking at how these different issues maybe transcend municipal boundaries. Often some of these issues are better addressed at the regional level because they're not entirely contained within a town, and they're not issues that are just faced by one town. They're faced by multiple towns. But the plan also recognizes that towns in our region are impacted differently when it comes to issues under these broad categories. So not all towns in the region are the same, and they're dealing with different challenges. So the plan helps to identify that too, just how towns in our region are dealing with different issues and need different types of support from WRC, from state agencies and other organizations. The regional plan has a similar timeline to the town plan. So once a regional plan is adopted, it remains in effect for 8 years and then needs to go through an update process. So what is the purpose of the regional plan? What role does it play for the region? First, it provides an assessment of the current conditions in our region. So the plan is updated every 8 years. It's a chance for us to look at where are we at in terms of population, housing construction, economic conditions, the status of the transportation system. With a plan update, we're looking backwards to see where we've come from, where we are today, and then looking at that data, making forecasts in terms of where we think we're going as a region. And that helps us provide guidance for direction and change and development in the region based on those different data points that we're looking at in the process. So we're looking at current conditions, and we're anticipating future issues and developing policies that are meant to help guide development in the region and to accomplish broad goals for the region. The document also establishes a policy basis for Windham Regional Commission in terms of the actions and positions it takes on different issues. And then it also helps us develop our annual work program. So as Chris mentioned, with the regional plan document, there are recommendations and actions in the plan that WRC carries out. And so we're able to incorporate those into our work program. But then there are also actions and recommendations that are carried out at the local level or in the nonprofit sector. And this is also related to what Chris was mentioning. A goal for this update process is really focusing on how the regional plan can help guide local planning efforts. So how can we make the plan a more useful tool for our member towns when they're dealing with their own local issues? Can the regional plan be more of a resource for our member towns? And then importantly too, the regional plan serves as the policy basis when Windham Regional Commission needs to engage in the review of development proposals under Act 250. That's the state land use permitting process. And then under Section 248 for energy generation and transmission, and Section 248A for telecommunication facilities. So just in terms of where we are at in the regional plan update process, so Windham Regional readopted its 2014 regional plan in the summer of 2021. And that gave us 8 years to update the plan. We, of course, are looking to update the plan much sooner than that, but that bought us some additional time to do a more complete update of the regional plan. So we kind of formally began the update process in the spring and summer of last year of 2022. And as you can see on the schedule, we're anticipating about a 2-year update process. So hoping to approve a updated plan in the spring of 2024. To start off the project, we met with WRC committees. We have a number of different committees at Windham Regional that focus on different topic areas. And different committees have different responsibilities in terms of looking at different sections of the plan and updating those. So we've been meeting with the committees that started fall of last year. During the winter months of this year, we got into more specifics with the committees, kind of looking at areas in the different chapters that need to be updated just based on the updated regional assessment and issues and challenges that we're aware of. And then at this point, spring into the summer, we're beginning that initial drafting process, updating chapters, and we'll be bringing those draft chapters to our committees for review and feedback. And we have a goal of having a first draft of the regional plan update that will be ready for public review in the fall of 2023. And we'd be holding a series of public meetings at that point to present the draft plan and get feedback. We'd then be updating the plan next winter, again with the goal of going through the public hearing and approval process in the spring of 2024. So that just gives you a sense of where we are. We're kind of roughly in the middle of the 2-year update process, but we're really getting into the more substantial work in terms of updating the content and the plan. So that provides an overview of who we are, Windham Regional Commission, and just the role of the regional plan. Next, we're going to focus on looking at some of the updated data that we've collected on population, housing, and economic conditions, and talk a little bit about some of the possible factors that are influencing this data. So I always like to share this graph. This is showing our region's population going all the way back to 1790 to 2020, when the last US Census was completed. And the population trends are similar statewide. I think this is a story that most people are familiar with, that Vermont's population and the Windham region's population was relatively stable from the early 1800s or so up until around 1950. And then during a period of several decades, the region saw more significant population growth from about 1960 to 2000. And this corresponded with the construction and opening up of the interstate highway system, and also the development and expansion of ski resorts in our region. And then, as you can see on this chart, our population growth began to level off around 2000, and then we've kind of had a slower but steady growth rate in the region between 2000 and 2020. And just to give you a sense of more specific numbers, just looking at the past 30 years, so this is looking at the region's population from 1990 to 2020. And during that time, we've only added about 5,000 residents, and about 3,000 of those residents were added between 1990 and 2000. So you can see the growth rate of growth slowed down significantly following 2000. So I think it's important to look at where population growth has occurred in the region. So this graph is showing a population comparison in 1950, and that's represented by the blue columns here, as compared to 2020, represented by the orange columns. And this is showing population in the two largest towns in the region, Brattleboro and Rockingham, as compared to the remaining 25 towns in the region. So in 1950, Brattleboro and Rockingham had a combined population greater than the other 25 towns in the region. And this, of course, makes sense with Brattleboro and Rockingham being the historic population and industrial centers in our region. And then between 1950 and 2020, nearly all the population growth in our region occurred outside of Brattleboro and Rockingham. And this kind of corresponds with a decline in some of the historic industries in those towns.
So like Jay and I wrote.
This corresponds with a decline in the historic industries in those towns, and also growth and development of ski resorts outside, more in the western part of our region. The growth that occurred beginning in the 1950s through the 2020s, at first, a lot of that was concentrated in towns in the Connecticut River Valley and the West River Valley, those towns that were in closer proximity to Brattleboro and Rockingham, and jobs located in those communities. But more recently, we've seen more of that population growth happening in the western part of the region, in and around ski resort communities. And a lot of this is a result of second home owners becoming full-time residents, also with the increasing prevalence of remote work. We are seeing more second homeowners being able to relocate here permanently and work remotely from their homes on a full-time basis. So the growth and development in the region has had impacts on our agricultural and forestry industries. And this is just looking at trends between 2010 and 2020. So for agricultural lands, the most current data we have is from 2017. As of 2017, we had a little over 400 farms in Windham County, with about almost 45,000 acres in agricultural use. So since 2012, during that 5-year period, there was a 7% decrease in the number of farms and a 12% decrease in the amount of land in agricultural use. And there's been a similar but more significant decline in the amount of acreage in woodlands. So between 2010 and 2020, there was almost a 20% decrease in total woodland acreage. And this trend, obviously this trend began before 2010. This is kind of a continuation of a trend that we've seen going back several decades. And it relates to the development shifting away from town and village centers to kind of more of a low density residential type subdivision that is taking up more acreage and taking away acreage from agricultural and forestry uses. Often land that has been in agricultural or forestry use it's often the land that's easiest to develop. And so that's another reason why you see these acreage numbers declining. Next, we're going to look at a couple slides just related to housing in the region. So this slide is showing the year, showing the total number of housing units per decade. So showing the years that structures were built in our region. The highest number of structures, just about 9,000, were built in 1939 or earlier. Brattleboro and Rockingham have the highest percentage of dwellings constructed during this time, 1939 or earlier, which makes sense just because those are the historical population centers in our region. But then you can see in this chart, the housing development trends really mirrors the population growth that we saw in the region, with housing production rising significantly beginning in 1960 and then peaking in the decades of the 1970s and 1980s, and then falling off after that. It's important to keep in mind too that the total number of housing units being constructed doesn't necessarily have a direct correlation with population growth. So, you know, in the decade of the 1970s, the almost 6,000 housing units that were built in that decade, all 6,000 of those units were not built for full-time residents. Just because we are a region that has a high percentage of seasonal homes, many of these housing units that were constructed during this time were for seasonal use versus full-time residents. And there's more data on the next slide regarding seasonal housing. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see in the decade of 2010 to 2020, only about 580 new dwellings were built in the region. And it's important to keep in mind too that even when there is new housing being constructed, there's still a natural decline in the existing housing stock. And that's a result of houses just getting old and starting to deteriorate. It's a result of house fires. It's a result of structures being damaged by floods. We don't know what the exact number of housing units that were lost in the decade of 2010 to 2020. But I think it's just important to remember that we definitely saw housing units lost during this decade. So we may not even be keeping up in terms of replacing housing units that were lost.
Hurricane Irene too.
Right. Yeah. Irene. Right. And you have major flood events like Irene that impacted many dwelling units during that time. And this low rate of housing construction is one of several reasons why we as a region are facing such a serious housing crisis. It's just we're not producing the number of housing units that are needed to keep up with demand. So this slide is looking at seasonal vacant housing units. And this is a technical term from the US Census Bureau. So seasonal vacant housing units, there's a definition on the upper right-hand corner of the slide. But this just refers to second homes in our region. So dwellings that are not used as full-time residences. And this chart is showing in each town the percentage of dwelling units that are seasonal homes, with the towns on the left-hand side of the chart being those with the highest percentage of seasonal homes, and those on the right hand being the ones with the lowest percentage. So not surprisingly, there's a concentration of seasonal homes in communities that are close to ski resorts or have ski resorts. So Stratton has the highest percentage of seasonal homes at just over 90%. Dover and Winhall both have about 80% of their housing is for seasonal use. And then Wardsboro, Windham, Wilmington, and Jamaica are all at about 60% for seasonal housing. And then you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, towns in the Connecticut River Valley generally have a lot lower rate of seasonal homes as compared to communities in the western part of the region. Just to note too, I have a little asterisk next to Somerset here. Somerset is the smallest town in our region with a population of 6 residents as of 2020. And so this data point of 100% of their housing being seasonal is not accurate, but it's so we just have an asterisk there. So and so I think I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Sue Westa at this point to walk through the next couple slides. So I'll advance here. Okay, go ahead, Sue.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So as you can all see, if you look at the slide closely, this shows how our population is aging, and that by the year 2030, we're expecting that over 82% of our population will be over 65 years old. And so we need to think about what this means for our region. For example, will we have enough housing to meet the needs of this population in the future? Those of us who will be over 65 by 2030 may be looking for different housing options than we currently have. And will the region be ready for it? Luckily, there's another group in our region that's currently looking at these issues, developing a plan for aging in the Windham region, but we need to make sure that our plan supports those efforts as well. Go ahead, Matt. Yep. So this next slide shows that we are becoming more diverse. Now it's all a matter of scale. You can see that green is the white population. We're still very majority white in our region. However, the blues and the yellows have increased since 2010. That is our Black and Hispanic and Latino populations. And so again, we need to understand what this means for the region. For example, are there, special needs that aren't being addressed in throughout our region, and we need to make sure that our plan supports those kinds of efforts as well. Go ahead, Matt. And here we have per capita income. Windham County's in the middle. The dark blue's 2010, the light blue's 2020. Vermont and the country are to the left, and to the right are our adjoining regions of Bennington and Windsor County. And you can see that since 2010, our region has fallen a little bit compared to the other regions. Our per capita income has decreased. So again, considering what that means for the region and what we need to do to support the lower and middle income populations of the region, which are fairly significant.
And so just a quick note there, we suspect that's probably showing it could be reflecting the closure of Vermont Yankee.
Right, yeah.
Because even though, I'm trying to remember the data, but Vermont Yankee employed, I think it was 1% of the population, but was responsible for 5% of the earned income in Windham County. So that's probably maybe seeing that. We along with our counterparts in Massachusetts and New Hampshire did commissioned a study from the Donahue Institute at UMass Amherst, and they estimated the direct and indirect job losses associated with the Vermont Yankee closure would be about 1,500 people. So that's, and a lot of that would be like in service sector, and so the losses would be really, and you know, job loss and income loss would be really insidious, really kind of difficult to track, but that may be what we're seeing there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sue.
You're welcome.
So just to summarize some of the trends that we're seeing in this data. So the region continued to see slow population growth. We saw the highest rate of population growth in the western parts of the region. Towns that are in the Connecticut River Valley saw a more stable population or declining residential populations during this time. We continue to see a decline in agricultural and woodland acreage. We have very low new housing construction, only 580 new units during the 10-year period. Our population is growing older and more diverse. Household incomes appear to be falling behind state and surrounding counties. And then I'll just note too that due to the effects of the pandemic and when a lot of this data was collected, there is more uncertainty in the data than usual, which makes it challenging. So the last census was completed in April of 2020, which was at the height of the pandemic. We do know that a lot of folks relocated to Vermont during the pandemic, and kind of time will tell if some of that relocation is a permanent move for individuals or if it was temporary during the pandemic. We've also seen in some of the economic data, not necessarily the economic data we just looked at, but some of the other economic data shows kind of significant downward trends in the economic data, and that may be as a result of the temporary economic conditions with businesses closing on a temporary basis during the pandemic. So the pandemic, it's all to say the pandemic introduces a lot of uncertainty and challenges into kind of analyzing and understanding the data. And we know things have changed too since a lot of the data was collected in 2020. We continue to see a lot of demand for housing in the region with folks looking to relocate here. And so, you know, anecdotally, we know there continues to be population increase in the region, but we don't know exactly what the numbers are. But that's something that we're aware of too. So the next few slides, I want to cover some of our broad goals for the regional plan update process. We've talked about some of these, but I want to go into them in a little more detail, just to give you a sense of the direction that we're going in. So these are some of the overarching goals. We are looking to support policies and infrastructure investments that can help the region achieve compact settlements and create conditions for more local housing that meets the region's needs. This is in line and consistent with state land use planning goals. The state has a general land use planning goals to support compact settlements surrounded by rural countrysides. The big question is how do we accomplish this? You know, I think this is development pattern that we would all like to see. But the more challenging question is, how do we get there? And some of the issues we know is that in trying to support more compact and more dense settlement within town and village centers is many of our villages lack the infrastructure to support that type of development, and most importantly, don't necessarily have public water or wastewater systems that can support higher levels of development. And just the way that many areas developed historically, there's limited options for creating infill housing without having that infrastructure in place. And then there's also a need for land use regulations that also support that type of development and additional housing within villages and town centers. We also need to plan and design our communities so that they can adapt to a changing climate. I think we all are aware of the increased number of heavy rain events that we're having in the region, and the impacts of those on structures and also on our local road systems. Towns are facing higher costs just in terms of maintaining their roads because of these heavier rain events. And so this is kind of something we need to balance. We're looking to encourage more growth in town centers and village centers. Historically, many of our villages and towns were built up adjacent to rivers and streams. And so how do we balance that, wanting to support growth, but also recognizing that some areas are more vulnerable to flooding. So how do we avoid those areas, or if we are building in those areas, make sure that development is done so that it's flood resilient, because this is an issue that we're going to face more and more of as a region. The next goal goes hand in hand with the first goal. In trying to support compact settlements, we also want to protect our forest lands and agricultural lands and habitat connectors outside of those centers. As we saw, we continue to see declining acreage in agricultural and forestry uses. Agricultural and forest uses really define the character and history of our region, and also provide important economic activity and jobs for our region. And then they also provide important ecosystem services that are going to be increasingly important due to climate change. And then finally, we need to plan for development facilities and services that support a population that's aging and growing more diverse. So we need to be aware of different needs that our population might have going forward, and assess whether what we currently have for housing and facilities and services is that meeting the needs of future residents. This is something we've touched on, but it's a really important goal for this update process, is we want to create a plan that's more accessible and useful for our member towns. So we want to make sure that we're addressing the specific issues and challenges that our towns are dealing with, and then include in the plan best practices and implementation tools for the towns to use. So as we've been talking about, for implementing the regional plan, Windham Regional Commission has a role, and our member towns also have a role in implementing the plan. So many of the goals will need to be implemented at the local level. For example, when it comes to how land is used and developed, that's determined at the local level through local zoning and subdivision regulations, and also in terms of making decisions about investing in infrastructure whether that's wastewater systems or transportation systems, the infrastructure to support development and to support vitality within village and town centers. So we want to make sure that the plan provides resources and examples for towns to consider when they're making decisions at the local level. You know, the plan isn't telling towns what to do, it's just giving them resources to help them through the decision-making process. And related to this is just developing a stronger implementation plan that provides more clarity on who is responsible for implementing different parts of the plan. So if it's WRC, if it's towns, state agencies, nonprofits, a lot of our work is collaborative between all these different entities. So also recognizing that too in the implementation plan, you know, efforts that need to be done collaboratively. And then this will make it clearer for people using the plan how we will put it into action. And finally, as Chris mentioned, a big change with this regional plan update process is we are moving our plan to a web-based format. So we hired Edgeworks Creative, which is a firm based in Waterbury, Vermont, to work with us on designing and developing a website that will host the regional plan once it's completed. So Windham Regional Commission is developing all the content for the plan, and Edgeworks Creative is just creating the site where all the content will go once it's finalized. And on the right-hand side of the screen here, this is a screenshot just from a preliminary draft of one of the pages from the website, just to give you a sense of what that would look like. We're still in the design and development phase of the website, but this gives you a sense of the direction we're looking to go in. One of the primary reasons for moving to a web-based plan is to make it more useful and easier to use. It will be easier to navigate to specific areas in the plan. There will be a search function, so someone would be able to search a specific term they might be looking for. We're going to have standalone pages for all of our policies and also for the implementation section of the plan. And this moving to the digital plan, it's also related to the previous goal of making the plan more useful for our member towns. The hope is that with the digital plan, the plan will just be more accessible and will be a resource that will be easier for towns to go to versus a hard copy of the plan and needing to look through that to find something specific. We're designing the website so that users would still have the ability to print the plan, print sections of the plan or the entire plan, and also download it as a PDF. But this is an exciting component of this regional plan update process. So how to get involved? You know, this wraps up the main portion of the presentation, but I wanted to give everyone a sense of how to stay involved in the process and make sure we have time to at the end for questions. So you know, as I mentioned, just walking through our schedule, we're just at the point where we're starting to have draft chapters that are ready for our different committees to review. And so we will have those draft chapters available on our website. And then you're always welcome to attend committee meetings. The schedule and agendas for those meetings are posted on our website. Just to give you a sense, of the different committees that are working on the update. Transportation obviously is looking at the transportation section. Energy is looking at energy. Natural resources is looking at the natural resources section. And then our community development committee is looking at a number of different chapters, including land use, housing, economic development, educational and cultural resources, and infrastructure, facilities, and services. But we'll be reviewing draft chapters with these committees over the upcoming months, with the goal of having a complete draft of the plan in its digital format for public review in the fall. It will be holding a series of public meetings and advertising those to review the draft plan and get feedback from members of the public. And you're, of course, are always welcome to reach out to us at WRC if you have questions or comments. We're happy to talk in more detail about the plan update process. So my email address and Sue's email address are listed here, and then also WRC's phone number as well. If you have any follow-up questions. But I think with that, I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time in case folks have any questions. And Sue, I don't know if you saw
I was just
anything in the
gonna
chat
say,
box.
maybe we should take the presentation down so we can see people better.
Oh, good idea.
And I do
Nice.
see Christina with her hand raised.
Okay.
Christina, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your
Hi.
question.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation and for including all of us. My question is maybe somewhat unique for the town where we are planning commissioners. We're in Guilford and there's no zoning. So I'm wondering how do we as a town support the WRC plan in terms of policies that have some teeth to them and implementation?
Want me to help answer that, Matt and Sue?
Yeah, if you want to take a shot at that.
So one thing to note about the regional commissions is we do have we have a role in Act 250, which is the state land use regulatory policy, in Section 248, which is the state energy generation and transmission regulatory process, and then also Section 248A, which is telecom transmission. Part of the regional plan is actually a definition of what constitutes a project that's considered to be regionally significant. And that's important because that defines, while we can participate in any Act 250 or Section 248 review, as far as like really what we deem to be regionally significant, the plan will actually define that. And this is where it gets to, and ultimately we issue no permits. We have no final decision making. The District Environmental Commission, the Public Utility Commission, they apply our regional plan policies. We advocate for them just like a town would participate in these processes as well. And the reason why that's important is it really, when it comes to smaller scale uses, it really is up to towns to determine what level they want to regulate any uses within land uses within their own town. And so critically, one of the best things that towns like Guilford and others can do, that whether you have zoning or not, is keep your town plan up to date. Plans are iterative documents. They really should be updated kind of continually over time. But another piece of that, is have conversations about from time to time about what level of regulation the town wants to take on. Vernon recently had us present to them about the what is involved in adopting a zoning bylaw and how to implement that. Matt did that presentation, and we can certainly always do that with Guilford. I know in Guilford that's a challenging topic, as it is in a number of other towns, but keeping your town plan up to date, being prepared to respond to an Act 250 application, Section 248 applications is important. And what we do when we get an application for Act 250 or Section 248, we always, Alyssa Sabeto is our lead on project review. Jack Cunningham chairs that committee. He's here and he may want to weigh in on this as well. I think Jack is still here. We always reach out to the towns where the project is happening to see what their take is on the project and how they plan to respond using the policies in their town plan. Jack, you want to say anything about this?
I think just one thing I'll add that kind of goes beyond the town plan. I think we have found in, I'd say probably 23, 24 out of our 27 towns, that they go through an Act 250 process very rarely, or a Section 248 process very rarely. And they're actually looking for as much help with the process. When can they file comments? What kind of comments can they file? What the rule in the process really is, almost more than what the particular policies in either their town plan or the regional plan might pertain. And that's a role we try to play as well.
Yeah, I would just add to that too. I think an important component when it comes to community development and encouraging growth and supporting our existing villages and town centers is making sure that towns are kind of continuing to invest and maintain and in the infrastructure and facilities that are so critical to supporting those centers as well. So, civic uses, recreational uses, and other infrastructure within those village and town centers that really helps support the existing population and helps attract new businesses and residents. And so I think even if a town doesn't have zoning in place, towns can still make those public investments to help sustain and encourage growth within certain areas.
And Guilford's actually a model for that. And I think sometimes you don't appreciate what a model you are, but like with Vernon considering whether or not to create a village center, a new village center, they modeled some of their process after what Guilford did as far as like creating a nonprofit to kind of help guide the development of wastewater and housing and all in Algiers Village. And so I know that's that wasn't necessarily easy for the town to do, but you guys really are a model for the region as a whole.
I see some questions down in the chat. Let's see. Thoughts regarding seasonal workers, newer relocating service employees, and a serious lack of a housing stock. And that's from Mike Purcell.
You want me to do this again, or do you guys want to do it? What's your preference?
You can go ahead.
So this is where the Regional Planning Commission, we're not empowered to build infrastructure any place. And it really is up to the towns. And we're seeing as some of our towns have grants now, to do both wastewater planning and then actually wastewater development, how really challenging it is even once they get the grants for the select boards to make a lot of challenging decisions that have to be made. But one of the keys to developing housing that's affordable, and by affordable housing, I mean housing that is affordable by the average person living here, meaning that they don't have to spend more than 30% of their gross income, household income during the month on housing to really develop a housing that's affordable at scale for the people who are already here. You have to have wastewater and water infrastructure so that you can actually build housing at a scale where the cost per unit are reduced. And by housing at scale, I mean like 20 to 25 at a minimum units at a shot. And so unless you have the wastewater infrastructure in place, it's really difficult to build affordable housing at any meaningful number or scale. And we have very limited number of communities, municipalities in the Windham region with wastewater, especially once you get into the West River Valley, Route 30 corridor. And even in Brattleboro, we've been working with Winston Prouty on potential housing development on what was the former campus of the Austin School for the Deaf. And even there are still wastewater and water challenges and getting the funding to do that. But it really requires action at the town level. We are more than happy to work with towns on having the conversations, beginning the conversations, continuing them, making the decisions around getting that infrastructure in place. Because really, until you have the infrastructure in place, it's really difficult for developers, whether you're a nonprofit developer like Windham Windsor Housing Trust or a for-profit developer, to make that pencil out unless you're building really large scale resort type development where the price point is beyond what most people who are here can afford. Jack, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that because I noticed the question also specifically looked at seasonal workers. We do, through the Act 250 process and the master planning process, work very closely with the major resort centers, principally in our area. The big ones are Mount Snow and Stratton. And they are somewhat required by statute to put a certain amount of funds away for housing for employees, because they're the ones that bring in, literally a couple of thousand employees for the winter that are all, for the most part, minimum wage or pretty close to it. And the resorts are responsible for providing a certain amount of housing for them. And I know both Stratton and Mount Snow are working in that area. They're both taking very different approaches to the problem, but there is a statute, and we work through it in our comments to the regional commission whenever they want to do anything, that they have put away put aside the funds required to develop seasonal housing for seasonal employees.
And Jack, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the past, before my time actually, we had tried to establish a number of units that the resorts have to provide. And I think, weren't we told by the courts or the district commissions that we can't do that by law?
Don't anybody quote me on this, because it's been a while since we've actually had a case where we've had to work at it. But I think there's a thing, I think it's called the Okemo formula. It was put together up at Okemo that they have to put away a certain percent of the development. If they want to do $1 million project, they have to put a certain percent of that money aside for affordable employee housing. In my estimation, I think in the estimation of my committee and probably the commission as a whole, the amount they have to put aside is disgustingly low. And I think we'd rather see that they have to provide X number of housing units rather than a certain amount of dollars, particularly in a world of inflation. It's more important to have numbers of beds and not numbers of dollars. So it's not where we would like it to be, but there is something there that at least helps. It starts to address the problem.
We have another follow-up question related to that asks how much housing is being gobbled up by Airbnb.
I'll just say, I'm not, when I talk about seasonal housing, it's not just the foreigners that they bring in and that they have to house, but I'm saying for people to try to relocate to this area, to be an employee for a plumber, a carpenter, what have you. Many of the seasonal rentals or even just year-round rentals are just being gobbled up in the resort area by groups utilizing the Airbnb services. And so a lot of the stock that used to exist is gone now. And I see that happening, not just here, but anywhere you go. So you have folks that are trying to make a living, but can't identify places for employees to work for them. And so I know some of the towns are trying to come up with different rules and regulations, about whether or not folks should be able to just turn their residences into hotels, that unregulated hotels. But for folks who want to live here, the rental stock is vanished. So I didn't know if there, I just didn't see any data that talked about, the aging population. We're not going to have anybody that can serve us because they can't live here.
Right.
Yeah, no, it is a challenge, and just hearing from businesses in the region that are, this has been mentioned, but businesses that are trying to hire folks, it's hard to find employees if they're not able to find a place to live.
That includes us, by the way.
That includes us. Yeah. So so we've faced that too. But yeah, I mean, the issue with short-term rentals, I know is an issue that the whole region is facing, but it is particularly acute in our communities in and around ski resort areas. And there are different models out there. I know Wilmington and Dover have formed a joint steering committee to look at the issue of short-term rentals and long-term rentals. And right now, there aren't many models here in Vermont, just in terms of examples that towns can look at. But I know that Wilmington and Dover are doing some good work on this front.
But this is another example of where, the regional plan can certainly provide data to this, about this, and provide information to towns as they deliberate it. But we at our scale, we would never see a permit about this. That this is something that would have to be regulated at a local level, and specifically by zoning. To the extent you can regulate it, and the other thing to keep in mind is it's a fairly complex issue because for some people, being able to rent out a room or a portion of the home is the way they afford their home.
Right.
And I'll just note in my own family's case, not making this about me, but I'll just share it. The reason my father was able to age in place was he converted part of our house into a bed and breakfast. And that was the reason why, and this was in Southwestern Virginia, why he was able to stay in our home, was he was able to make money off of it. And so it's not as straightforward an issue as you might think. And so as towns deliberate this, and this can be a role of the regional plan, is provide information, provide data about things to think about. You really need to have a robust conversation about what is the nature of those rentals in your town. And is it just people buying up property and renting it out? Are there people who are using that to be able to afford their own mortgages? What does it look like in each town? Because it may vary a good bit. And Sue, I don't know if you have any more you want to say about that.
Yeah, no, and I've heard a lot of this conversation because I was able to participate in the Wilmington and Dover conversation, and there were a lot of good arguments made on both sides, and there are a whole range of things that communities can do. Regulation is at one and no regulation at the other, but in between there's other things like just registering properties like that so that the community can address issues when they come along. And yeah, I know that Wilmington and Dover took a really hard look at all those things, and those will be lessons, the rest of us can learn from.
Yeah, I guess what I was looking for is you talk about, economy of scale, and like even though I work Wilmington and Dover, I'm a Marlboro person, and we've discussed, a conservation commission or whatever, you know, density bonuses to create the kind of place that you talk about. And so, you know, a Windham regional policy that would be in support of something that would try to address some of that is just what I was, you know, kind of alluding to.
Absolutely.
And just, that's one of the challenges we have, because planning in Vermont is so diffuse, because it's done in such these tiny geographies. Doing things like when I worked in Maryland, it was really easy at a county level to create, you know, conserved areas and concentrated growth areas, and doing density bonuses. You know, what farmland are we going to conserve, and what density bonuses would you give to create new town centers? It's really challenging here to do that within these tiny geographies of the towns. I think it can be done, but it's, you know, you're doing it within these really tiny spaces. And so, yeah, it's, there's some things that just by the nature of planning in Vermont make some of those land use planning tools really difficult to use. I know this is kind of geeky stuff, but it's important for people to understand.
And we have another comment here from Edie Edwards from Halifax, who says, it seems we're starting with a disadvantage there because of the high percentages of part-time homeowners. And that may be the case.
There's irony there too, in that, in my experience, even with our own commissioners, is that a lot of the part-time homeowners of yesterday are now the full-time homeowners of today, and serve as our Windham Regional commissioners and planning commissioners and select board members and everyone else. So it looks like Edie is saying that she's one of them.
Indeed, guilty.
Yeah, complex. I don't see any other questions in the chat, Matt.
Well, thanks, Sue. And if there aren't any other questions, I just want to thank everyone for taking time this evening to listen to the presentation and learn a little more about the Windham Regional Plan update, the process that we're going through. And as I mentioned, you know, feel free to contact us at any time with questions or comments, or if you want to know more. But there will be more opportunities to review drafts of the plan and provide feedback on that. This is really kind of meant as a introductory presentation, just to give you a sense of what we're working on. But again, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Matt.